Now, the first question I will try to answer is, what kind of law on abortion do we want to see, if any? And there is not one answer to that question. First of all, the belief that the female reproductive biology defines women's main purpose in life, i.e. to become a mother, is deeply ingrained in people's cultures, in their religions, and in their thinking. Children are the future, they're owned by everyone, and everyone has an interest in ensuring that they're produced and cared for. Women are traditionally considered the key means to that end. And that means considered by the state, by religion, by those who run the economy, the military, traditional leaders, and men as spouses, as well as parents and families. And the fact is that low total fertility rates, that is only 1 or 2 children per woman, are becoming more common in a growing number of countries. And both
Más común en países, en un gran número de países.
Mortality rates and the consequences of additional deaths from wars, and I think we should add pandemics to this, exacerbate demand for more children. And this is in the face of not necessarily connecting that with whether the earth can cope with more children or not. So the consequence is that the importance of the transfer to women of autonomy over reproduction and over our own bodies and what it will take to achieve this cannot be overstated. I think this is the crux of the issue here. Now, pregnancy has 4 possible outcomes: a live birth, a miscarriage, a stillbirth, or an induced abortion. And then there is infanticide. And infanticide has been historically always been very common before any forms of abortion became safe. And women may, even today, be criminally published for all but live births. Now, here's some statistics. There are 140 million births per year globally. There are 23 million miscarriages. There are 2 million stillbirths and 4 million infant deaths in the first year of life. And there are 73 million induced abortions. And 200 million women have no access to contraception, which puts them at higher risk of unwanted pregnancy if they're having sex with a man. Now, these figures come from 4 different years, and it's because I tried to stick with World Health Organization data, and they are not published every year, but they're a good enough indication to you of how many of these different events take place. In 2017, there were almost 300,000 maternal deaths globally, of which 8 to 13% were from unsafe abortions. Now, that number of 295,000 is half of what it was when I first started working in this field. So a great deal has happened, and the percentage of unsafe abortions within that number has gone down substantially. So it's an indication that work on this subject has been happening at a good level and is improving the situation finally. The global total fertility rate, that is the number of births per woman, was 2.4 in, I can't see the year here. Let me see if I can move my slides over slightly. No, I can't. Probably 2.4 births in 2019. And that had fallen from 5 births per woman in 1960. And 2.1 births is the rate at which the population would start growing, 2.1 births per woman. So we're getting very close to that. And on average, 29% of pregnancies, that's 3 out of 10, ended in induced abortion in 2020. And that tells you why induced abortion has a very big impact on the total fertility rate. Abortion is regulated in most countries by the criminal law, which has been passed by parliaments or Supreme Courts and is subject to control by the justice system. And that means either the police or the courts or the prison. And the health system is a source of major control. And in fact, in some health systems, if you arrive with complications from an illegal abortion, it may be the healthcare provider that reports you to the police. In some countries, control is by civil law, and in other countries by traditional or religious law. Women have been sent to prison for having illegal abortions and also for having miscarriages and stillbirths that have been treated by the police and the courts as homicide. And they've been given prison sentences as high as 25 to 40 years in Mexico and El Salvador. And this is imprisonment for abortion has happened in many other countries. I've listed only a few of those here. Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, USA, UK, Spain, Senegal, Kenya, Rwanda, Morocco, just as examples. In Senegal in 2018, the campaign did a research study on among 5 different national research studies looking at imprisonment of women for abortion. And the Senegal study found that the offenses of abortion and infanticide accounted for 38% of the female prison population. Women suspected of either illegal abortion or infanticide were subject to an average of 9 months pretrial detention in addition to their prison sentence. And this is just a photograph of one of the prisons where quite a lot of women were imprisoned. Now, decolonization has become a major issue globally. And so I want to talk about, on this slide, about the fact that a British law from the 19th century was imposed on all British colonies and what the consequences of that have been. The law in question is called the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act, and it's still on the books in Great Britain and in every, I think every or almost all former British colonies. The law has about 100 different sections covering all sorts of criminal behavior, but sections 58, 59, and 60 define criminal behavior in reference to pregnancy and abortion. Now, I've rewritten the wording because the wording from 1861 is a bit weird. So section 58 says that if a pregnant woman or another person with intent to cause a miscarriage administers to herself any poison or other harmful thing, or uses any instrument or other means with intent to cause a miscarriage, they shall be guilty of a felony with punishment up to life in prison. Section 59 criminalizes anyone who supplies a poison, harmful drug, or instrument to another person to cause a miscarriage. So it's not only the people who are doing the abortion, but the people who supply the means to do the abortion that are criminalized. And then in section 60, you are criminalized if you hide a birth and if you hide the body of a dead baby. And of course, these are other reasons why there have been imprisonments, including in Britain and including in the last 20 years here. Now, the only former British colony that has attempted to remove this law from their statute books, apart from Canada, in fact, who I'll come back to in a couple minutes, is Sierra Leone. In 2016, their parliament passed a law making abortion legal and removing the Offences Against the Person Act, 1861, from the law. That was in the text of the bill. The president, however, by quorum, refused to sign the bill into law. That meant that it could go back to the parliament to be reconsidered, and it was passed unanimously, which is almost unheard of in any country. And technically, it should have automatically made the bill into law because it was unanimous. However, he still refused to sign it because he was dependent on support from religious leaders who were very, very opposed. Now, in early July 2022, so that's this year, the current president of Sierra Leone announced at the 10th African Conference on Sexual Health and Rights that his cabinet had unanimously backed a bill to decriminalize abortion. And that bill is tabled for a vote, or is to be tabled for a vote in their parliament sometime this month, September, according to this news report, which I only found a couple of days ago. But that bill has not been passed, and I've not been able to find any news, at least through Google, since the July news, whether anything further has happened in Sierra Leone on that bill. Anyway, this is a photograph from the conference where he made that announcement. It was in July, it was in Freetown, and it was called Accelerating the Elimination of Sexual and Gender-Based Violence in Africa. Now, one of the consequences of legalizing the right to life from conception, which is what anti-abortion movements want to do, and have in some cases managed to do, is that the police and the courts are arresting women who've had a miscarriage or stillbirth, claiming they have purposely caused it, convicting them of homicide, and throwing them in prison. The story is almost always the same. The woman is from a poor minority rural background. She has an unexpected and rapid life-threatening delivery of her pregnancy early. She falls unconscious. The newborn baby dies and may not even be viable enough to survive. There is a report to the police and she's arrested, even though there is no evidence of intent to end the pregnancy. She cannot afford legal counsel, so she's put on trial, found guilty, and imprisoned. And these cases have happened particularly in El Salvador, quite frequently. In Senegal, if she tries to hide the baby's body, she may be charged with infanticide. And most of the people who do this are very young. Many became pregnant through coercion, rape, and sexual abuse. Now, before I go on, Shruti and I had agreed that I would stop periodically and take questions from all of you. This might be a good place to stop and do that. Does anybody have any questions they want to ask? Shruti, you might want to tell people what they have to do in order to put a question.
You can put your questions in the chat box, or you can raise your hand. If there are any clarifications needed. Okay, Marge, I believe everybody is following, so we can carry on.
Okay, great. Thank you. And if I forget to do this again in a few minutes, please remind me.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so I want to look next at countries with specific forms of legal regulation. These include clauses in national constitution, and those exist in at least 20 countries. And I realized when preparing these slides this morning that I've never found a list of those 20 countries. So I'm going to have to go looking for it. The only one I know for sure is Ireland. Before Ireland, some abortions legal, it was in their constitution to make abortion illegal. Now, other places with specific forms of legal regulation include constitutional court or Supreme Court rulings, when somebody has taken a case to the court to try and get them to address the legal situation. And those have happened, for example, in the US in 1973, 2016, and of course, as you all probably know, again this year, in Canada in 1988, in Colombia in 2006, and again this year, in Brazil in 2012 and 2018, in the UK regarding Northern Ireland, which made abortions illegal in Northern Ireland, and in India twice, in 2017-18, and again this year in relation to making abortion legal up to 24 weeks for married women initially, and then this year also for unmarried. The other kind of law that's very common for abortion, and more than I thought it was, covers a lot of Western Europe, including Belgium, France, Portugal, and Spain, and their colonies, Turkey and Japan, most of Latin America, non-Anglophone sub-Saharan Africa, former Soviet republics in Central and Western Asia. And these kinds of legal restrictions include upper time limits, delay between the request for an abortion and the procedure as two examples, but they don't criminalize women or providers. But you still have to stay within the restrictions of the law. Then there's customary or religious law, which may well be enforced like criminal law, and it is in place, for example, in Bangladesh, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Pakistan. And then there's case law, which occurs relating to individuals who are prosecuted or who go to court to seek a judgment that an abortion can be treated as legal. And this latter bit of seeking a court judgment was happening very often in India, up to the point where the highest court decided to allow abortions up to 24 weeks. They had one woman after another going to court trying to get permission for an abortion after 20 weeks, almost always in relation to a fetal anomaly. The other thing that is restricted is who can provide services. Many countries say it can only be an OBGYN, and then other regulations appointing gatekeepers, who are mainly doctors and but also spousal and parental consent, age requirements, and then there are waiting periods, and on and on and on. Abortion is legally probably the most restricted health care service that exists. Now, then there are other things that affect the law that are directly in the law, and Morocco is an example of this, where unmarried women would be excluded even if the law was changed to allow abortion, because it's illegal to have sex outside marriage in Morocco. So that law would also need to be changed if abortion were permitted, assuming that they would allow unmarried women to have legal abortions. And then in India, Vietnam, China, and South Korea, sex determination and/or sex selection are illegal, affecting access mainly to second trimester abortion services, because women simply can't be trusted when they say they have other legitimate reasons for second trimester abortions. They're often not believed, although it's often very true. And many people who consider themselves pro-choice, and most of the parliamentarians in the country I'm living in, still support certain legal restrictions, and particularly upper time limits on abortion. To allow legally abortion up to 24 weeks is not very common, and to allow it after 24 weeks, as far as I know, is no longer possible anywhere. Although in this country, where in the UK, it used to be 28 weeks, but it was lowered probably 30 years ago now. And then there's situations in which groups campaigning for laws to legalize abortion end up campaigning for very limited grounds. And Chile was a good example of this several years ago, because it became quite clear that a limited law is all that you can get, and you might as well go for a very limited law rather than continue with the one you have, which is even more limited. So the movement in Chile accepted 3 grounds for abortion instead of fighting for the one they really wanted, which was abortion on request. Now, absence of the law also creates, absence of specific bits in the law also create problems. So for example, second trimester abortions account for 10 to 15% of all abortions globally, and as many as 25% in India and South Africa. Yet in a number of countries with restrictive laws, second trimester abortions are not even mentioned in the law. And so that leads to sometimes complex processes for trying to change or remove these bits of the law. But I think even more important is lack of knowledge of what is and is not in the law. And that is very widespread around the world and is especially common in countries where abortion is highly restricted. Even when an abortion would be legal, women and health professionals may not realize it, and health professionals may be afraid to provide abortions if no one else is doing them. And they especially fear that if there's no protection in the absence of enabling regulations. And I'll come to this a bit later in the talk. This is a photograph from February this year, where Ecuador had previously allowed abortion on the grounds of rape and sexual abuse in a relatively limited law otherwise. And then the president tried to reduce the number of weeks of pregnancy that would be legal. And then the women's movement campaigned against the reduction of the number of weeks. Okay, shall I stop again and see if there are any questions?
Yes, Marge, there is one question from Lisa,
Okay,
who has written in the chat box.
okay.
She's asking, do you think it is better to remove all upper time limits? So also after 28 or 30 weeks. So I leave it on you how to answer that.
Absolutely. I have no problem with that question. Thank you. I think it's probably one of the most important questions there is in terms of discussing legalization of abortion. And the reason I think so is because there is, as a pregnancy proceeds, you know, what starts off as a group of cells, the tiny little group of cells, ends up becoming a baby. And the closer you get to delivery, the more is developed, has all its bits, and, you know, is more like a baby. And so there's very few people who would like to see abortion legalized beyond 24 weeks for that reason. But the problem is that there have always been situations where that was necessary and then exceptions had to be made. And in Britain, interestingly, we had at one point only 6 OBGYNs who were prepared to do late abortion. And every one of them had started practicing when abortion was illegal. And they had had to deal with the complications of women trying to end late abortions by themselves. And they were very unpleasant complications, as you can well imagine. So they were willing to go beyond the legal limit and help women who were among these exceptions. And there was literally a handful of them. There were almost none, but there were always some. And then the country moved to the right on this topic, and those doctors retired or died, and the younger doctors were not prepared to make that same decision. And so they lowered the upper time limit to 24 weeks. And it's almost impossible to get an abortion here after that now. I personally feel that those abortions will always be a tiny number, and they will always be the most important emergencies. And so I think there should be no time limit. But I'm in a very small group. It would be, if you would like to, let's see, I didn't see your name.
Lisa.
Lisa, if you would like to say something about what you think in answer to your own question, I'd be happy to hear it. Or if anybody else wanted to make a comment on what I've just said. Lisa, you don't want to say anything? Oh, one new message. You can't unmute yourself.
Just give me 1 second. Yes.
Can you do something? Great, thank you.
Yes.
I think, yeah. She may have said something more.
Hi, yes, I'm here now. I
Here
just
we
want to say
go.
thank you so much for your elaborate answer. I just noticed that I do not have that much information about this yet, so it was very clarifying to me, and I definitely agree with you now. I understand that in a very specific situation, it's so much more important to, yeah, have health come before all these legal constraints. So thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions listed?
No,
I'm
not right
having a
now.
bit of trouble with the chat box because I see there are new messages, but no, okay. Okay, so I will go on. This is, but thank you for that question. It's always a question that I want to answer in these conversations. This is a slide about the main legal grounds for abortion. And what's so interesting about this is that in spite of there being more than 200 countries in the world, there are really only 6 legal grounds for abortion in almost all of them. There are a few extra bits that get thrown in by countries, but these are the ones that turn up almost everywhere. The most minimal, and as you go down this list, each one that you add to the one before it has influences more abortions than the one before it. So that at the bottom, if abortion is on request, that affects the most and allows the most women to have an abortion. Whereas to save the life or if there's a risk to the life, that covers really the least number of abortions, because most of us are now healthy enough that pregnancy, unless there's a complication in the pregnancy, pregnancy doesn't kill women like it used to. Preserving the health and the mental health, or the mental well-being, sometimes phrased, is the second one. Rape and sexual abuse and incest are the third. Fetal anomaly is the fourth, and fetal anomaly in most laws up until the last 15 years or so always said serious fetal anomaly. Now, some countries, and I believe they're Catholic countries, mostly require it to be fatal fetal anomaly, which of course, the line between serious and fatal is not always clear. But when something is clearly fatal, then it means that the baby would not survive after birth more than days or weeks after delivery. Then there are economic and social reasons. And economic reasons are the case for everybody living in poverty. And social reasons are especially the case for single and young women who aren't supposed to be having sex with men in any case. But there are also important reasons why people with a large family, for example, are unable to have additional children to what they already have, because what you need to remember is that abortions are often requested at a point where the completion of the family has been achieved, and both the parents do not want to have further children. It isn't that abortions happen only to women who've never had a baby before. In fact, quite the opposite. And then there's on request can be up to, well, 6 weeks is silly, but of course, Texas is just, in the US, has just passed a law about abortion up to 6 weeks. Or it can be on request up to 14, 18, or 24 weeks. Very few countries allow abortion on request up to 24 weeks. They usually allow it on request in the first trimester, or maybe in Scandinavia up to 18 weeks. And then they start limiting the grounds and restricting them more and more. Now, this figure here indicates the number of deaths, and each little green circle represents a country. They represent the number of deaths for those 6 grounds at the bottom of the figure. And you can see, I don't know if you can see my finger, but this slide sort of goes in a angle like this. So the more grounds you add to the law, the fewer deaths. And the fewer deaths, by far, the fewest deaths are if abortion is on request. So that is indicative, because women seek abortions and have abortions, whether it's legal or it's not legal. And the only difference is that it's more likely to be unsafe if it's illegal, except now, recently, until medical abortion pills came into being and started to be commonly used. Oh, my screen is not allowing me. There we go. Right. The role of the International Conference on Population Development in relation to post-abortion care. This for me is a very important kind of an issue. At this conference in 1994, which took place in Cairo, it is now believed that the negotiation on the subject led to a statement about abortion that was very helpful. In fact, it led to statements about sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights, not sexual rights, that were very important. But what it did for abortion, in my opinion, was to take us way backwards for a very long time. And we're only beginning to get past that now. Because the countries who participated in that conference had to reach a consensus on all the points that went into the document, and abortion was the most contentious basis for disagreement in the conference. So they were up all night, they spent hours, and the final so-called compromises that were agreed, and I've listed 3 of them, although there are more, are the following. In circumstances where abortion is not against the law, such abortion should be safe. That was the killer, because the places where abortion is not safe are the places where abortion is against the law. So this basically says if abortion is against the law, it doesn't have to be safe, okay? And indeed, that is what's still happening. The second one was, in no case should abortion be promoted as a method of family planning. Now, unfortunately, abortion is a method of family planning, and it's really nothing else. So that also created problems, because so many governments and so many donors are prepared to provide grants to countries for promoting contraception, but they're not allowed to promote abortion. So that was what this one was about. And this one has affected USAID funding to countries in the global South ever since. And the third one was that diagnosis and treatment for complications of abortion should always be available as required. Now, that's positive in the sense that what they're saying is where abortion's illegal, where it's unsafe, the country is still required to diagnose and treat the complications in order to save the woman's health and life. And in fact, that is why so many countries where abortion is still almost totally illegal now provide post-abortion care, because on the basis of this clause. And it has meant that many countries have gone that far and refused to go any further. That actually really gets up my nose, because it's a gross violation of public health principles, I think, and human rights. So I have always been very angry about this, and I wrote this paper at the bottom of the screen to talk about it. Now, the global problem of the screen is, okay, decriminalizing abortion. Sorry, folks, the line that's at the bottom of the screen for everybody else is sitting on top of my slides, so I can't see the top line anymore. I want to go on to talk about decriminalizing abortion and show you how it's very different from legalizing abortion. I define decriminalizing as not punishing anyone for providing or for providing the means for abortion, i.e. pills, not punishing anyone for having an abortion, not punishing anyone for providing information on safe abortion services or self-use of medical abortion pills, not involving the police in investigating or prosecuting anyone for safe abortions, including providers, not involving Parliament or the courts in deciding whether to allow abortion in law or in individual cases, applying other existing laws to deal with coercive, dangerous, or negligent practices related to unsafe abortions, and lastly, treating abortion like every other form of bona fide health care. Now, that's a hefty definition. It probably only applies in Canada, not anywhere else, because almost everywhere else has, to some extent or not, legalized abortion instead. So let's go on to conscientious objection and decriminalization. And I'll start at the bottom of the screen with the point I want to make, which is that there are only 5 countries in the world who do not allow health professionals to conscientiously object and refuse to do abortions. And those countries are Finland, Iceland, Sweden, Bulgaria, and the Czech Republic. Conscientious objection was first put into the abortion law in Britain in 1967. And it was put there because previously conscientious objection only applied if a person refused to do military service for religious or ethical reasons. It was never applied to healthcare before that time. And it was put into the law here because they believed that the doctors in the country would not accept legal abortion unless they had the right to opt out of it. And of course, this has allowed many, many health professionals to opt out of doing abortions all over the world ever since then. And my views on this subject are that those who oppose abortion should not be able to prevent access to or to provide abortion. They should not be able to provide abortion. It is possible to ensure the right to have an abortion and also the right of health professionals not to provide abortion care. If somebody is opposed to abortion, it's the last person you want to do an abortion for you, I should think. I certainly feel that way. So some way has to be found to make everybody achieve their preferred end on this question. And so in order to do this without punishing women, it's incumbent on health to ensure that all women seeking abortions can access services directly without an intermediary or the need for a referral that can be then delayed or blocked. It should also be required, and this is what the law in Sweden says. It should be required that trained for and provide any healthcare service that may or will involve abortion, a person must sign that they are willing to participate in abortion care. And if not, they must choose medical training in any other area of medicine that they have no objection to. And this is based on a series of court cases that took place in Sweden about 15, 20 years ago, where a woman who was training to be a midwife and who was anti-abortion was asked to sign the document when she was offered training as a nurse dealing with obstetrics and gynecology, not with abortion. And she signed the document. And then after she finished the course, she refused to do abortions. And basically she went to court over the next 5, 6, 7 years, I can't remember exactly, right up to the European Court of Human Rights, trying to get this requirement in Sweden to be removed from the law. But the requirement was retained, and the European Court said that Sweden had a right to make that restriction in the situation. And that made a lot of news at the time all over Europe. So, and I think when you start looking at it from the point of view that you can protect both the woman and the health professional to have what they want out of the situation, then we may get past the need for conscientious objection. But right now, most health professionals insist on conscientious objection because they feel that they won't be allowed to say they won't do the procedure anymore. So that's an ongoing problem, I think, almost everywhere. Shall I stop again and ask if there are any questions?
Yes, I can see there are a lot of discussions happening in the chat.
Ah, that's great. I can't. But I think you should carry on having your discussions in the chat. But let me ask if there are any, I'll have to read that later. Are there any questions meanwhile? Or any comments? They don't have to be questions. No?
Marge, there is a basic question, which is how many times is one allowed to do abortions?
Allowed?
To do abortions, yes.
To do abortions or to have an abortion?
I
do
think what they
abortion is
mean
what
is
I
to
have-
have an abortion.
So how many times? That's a very good question as well. Well, I don't think there's any law that says, I know there is no law that says you may only have one abortion in your life. The majority of those who have abortions only have one abortion. 2 abortions is not uncommon, however. And the more you go up in numbers, the fewer there are who have had that experience. most people would like to, you know, having had one abortion, reckon they'd rather avoid doing it a second time or more. On the other hand, you don't have to feel stigmatized or as if something's wrong with you if you have more abortions, because there was a time in history and in most of history when contraception was not as available or as effective as it is now. And I can recall when I was in my 20s, going to live in Crete in Greece for 6 months. And I was in a village and had a conversation with women in that village, almost all of whom had had between 10 and 20 abortions in their lifetimes because they had no contraception, none. And so I think that's a kind of answer to your question. But I think for the most part, we have reached the stage, and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union countries, when the Soviet Union existed, there was very little contraception available until quite recently, and a large number of abortions were very common. But I think at this stage in our lives, there's more preference to use a contraceptive and try to avoid abortion. Does that answer the question? I hope. Okay. All right. Silence means carry on to me, so I should carry on. Legalizing versus decriminalizing abortion. Now, I'm coming back to this because I don't think that I've said enough about it yet. For many years, abortion rights movements in many countries have called for safe, legal abortion. And as I've already said, legalizing means keeping abortion in the law in a positive form by identifying why, when, and for whom it's allowed. And many countries have expanded their legal grounds for abortion in the past 40 to 50 years, and often more than once. I think Sweden changes their law about every 4 years, as far as I remember. The calls for decriminalizing abortion have emerged more recently. And now many people have begun to use these two terms interchangeably, but I hope you can see that they don't mean the same thing. As I said before, Canada is the only country that has completely decriminalized abortion. There was a Supreme Court decision in 1988, and they took abortion out of the law altogether, and they have never done anything to change that decision, although there have been attempts by anti-abortion movements to affect it. Canada is a very pro-choice country compared to many. The parliaments of Luxembourg and France legalized abortion in 2014 and 15 respectively, but they retained civil law restrictions. And the same is true in Australia, who have allowed abortions up to 24 weeks. China is a strange exception in this situation. Nobody was able to find any written law in China on abortion. But when the communists took over the government, it was probably the poorest country in the world, and certainly had and still has about a quarter of the entire global population in its borders. And they simply couldn't cope with high fertility rates. So they made it illegal to have more than one child. Women who got pregnant more than once were often forced to have abortions that they didn't want. And these had to be carried out primarily by nurses and midwives. And that has continued, or it did continue, until quite recently, when it became clear that the numbers of children being born was out of balance with the numbers of old people who were surviving into quite high ages, and there weren't enough workers to support the economy and to support people's living standards. And so the Chinese this year, for the first time that I'm aware of, said that they were restricting abortion to medical reasons only. And that's pretty amazing, really. I don't know what's going to happen as a consequence of that, but that's quite an exception compared to what is usually the case. Oh dear me. Okay. Now, whoops. Sorry, I'm still trying to get a view of my heading. The last thing I wanted to say about legalization versus decriminalization is that I went to a workshop in South Africa in 2018 for the campaign, and I organized a 3-day seminar with about 20 participants in the conference to talk about abortion. And at the end of those 3 days, that group had convinced me that legalization was better than decriminalization. And the reason, they said, was that it was necessary as protection for both women and abortion providers. And that if the law didn't say this and this and this are allowed, then people could always be accused of breaking the law. So that has changed my thinking a great deal, although it hasn't given me any answers on how to deal with the complications of trying to get a good law out of a conservative country. So the WHO abortion guidance that was published on the 8th of March on International Women's Day this year is probably the best source of law and enabling regulations on abortion. It's a far more radical document than has been possible coming from WHO in the past. And it's a very good blueprint to work from. I've said what I had to say about Canada already, but I think the problem around legalization is that as soon as you start debating in a country what the legal grounds for abortion should be, you could end up arguing until you pull your hair out, basically. On the other hand, if you want to have a good law, then these conversations are absolutely essential. Now, we're getting support from places that we never used to get it. There are a growing list of UN human rights bodies who have played an increasingly visible role in calling for progressive abortion law reform. And those include the Human Rights Committee, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Political Rights, the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women in Law and Practice, and a whole string of special rapporteurs, including the ones on health, the rights of women in Africa, and the rapporteur on torture. And then there are a growing list also of regional bodies who have done the same, and those include the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the European Court of Human Rights, and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, who have also been very active in this regard. And the African Commission called in January 2016 for the decriminalization of abortion across Africa in line with the Maputo Protocol, and renewed that call in January 2017. And that made big waves across the region. And I suspect was a starting point for all the discussions about changing the law in many countries across that region ever since then. This is an example of Sorry. Oops. This slide is about France, and it's about a law that was put in to revise the Constitution and modernize the Constitution to guarantee equality between women and men. And among its recommendations are the constitutional right to access contraception and abortion. And this is the link to that law in French. And I feel that this is the only way to treat women as full human beings and as full citizens in a society. And not to do so represents discrimination against women on the grounds of their sex and as a denial of their human rights. It hasn't actually led, it has led to a better law on abortion in France than they've had before. They're slowly improving their law thanks to a very active abortion rights movement. But this is the kind of gender and sex equality sort of legal that is very useful to have in support of changing the law. Now, taking abortion out of the criminal law or out of the law altogether means you can provide abortion as an integral part of sexual and reproductive health care. It means you can omit grounds for abortion and the role of the medical profession, the courts, parents, and partners as gatekeepers to abortion. It doesn't mean omitting appropriate health professionals as providers, who could be OBGYNs, other doctors, midwives, community nurses, and now particularly pharmacists, now that we have abortion pills. But it does mean the woman's decision is enough and that self-managed abortion should be permitted. And most importantly, it makes motherhood a choice. So the photograph on this page is from Chile. And it was taken in, I think, 2017 when their new law passed that has 3 grounds. And this was inside the parliament with all the activists who were involved in it. And of course, the new president of Chile has said that they want to liberalize that law even more, but it hasn't quite happened yet. So a little historical perspective is that advocates of safe legal abortion have been trying to put the abortion decision into women's hands for over 100 years now, ever since a woman called Alexandra Kollontai convinced Lenin in the Soviet Russia to pass the first legal abortion law, which happened in 1920. It's been 30 years since Canada took abortion out of the law, but no other country has followed them. And I ask myself why, and I don't know the answer. And it's also been more than 30 years since it's been possible to have the means of abortion in our own hands. Misoprostol, I don't know if you're aware, was discovered by one woman in Brazil who bought misoprostol for gastric ulcers for someone in her family. And she read the paper inside that told you, you know, what the medication might cause. And it said, do not take if pregnant, may cause miscarriage. And the woman said, aha. And the next time she knew somebody was pregnant and didn't want it, she gave them misoprostol, or it was perhaps herself, I can't remember anymore. But an abortion followed. And the word got around Brazil very rapidly. And by the end of the 1980s in Brazil, the maternal mortality rate from unsafe abortion had dropped substantially. Now, abortion pills were first manufactured and approved in France in 1988. And when the original pharmaceutical company that produced them got worried, I think they were, got worried because they were afraid that their anti-abortion customers would stop using their other medications because they were selling abortion pills. The French government said they were not allowed to stop producing them in France because they were the property of women. I don't know that you'd hear anybody saying that now. I think I'm going to stop because Shruti and I had agreed that we would leave 10 or 15, 20 minutes for discussion. So you'll be able to read these slides on your own afterwards. They're basically examples of governments getting together in groups and passing resolutions on abortion. This one was, well, the first one was the Maputo Protocol. This one in 2022 was 46 European countries who passed a resolution about stopping anti-choice harassment of abortion clinics. And then on the next page, it was a resolution by 59 governments talking about protecting sexual and reproductive health and rights in response to the COVID-19 crisis. That's this page. So the last things I really want to say are, how do you change the law? And the answer is that successfully changing the law and making abortions available, because those are two separate steps, is always the work of years. Advocates don't get a lot of chances to change the law and need to decide what they want to add before campaigning for it, with the confidence that whatever they propose has a chance of being implemented, because you may not get another chance again soon. And above all, allies are crucial. Those include parliamentarians, health professionals, legal experts, all the women's groups and organizations on every topic, human rights groups, family planning supporters, but above all, and I mean really above all, women themselves. And achieving a critical mass of support. This is the first lesson I learned when I got involved in abortion advocacy. Achieving a critical mass of support among all these groups is key to successful law reform and to defeating the opposition. Groups are working in national coalitions to get women released from prison. This woman was a very famous case in El Salvador, and a women's group called the 17 was formed in order to get all the 17 women they knew of who were in prison out of prison. And her case was probably one of the most famous. This is a group in South Korea that was formed in 2017. Their first actions were a solidarity demonstration in support of Polish women, which is in the photograph, and also a petition on 28th of September to the president of South Korea calling for abortion law reform. And they collected 235,000 signatures. And that's an enormous number for such a small country. This is another example of how work for abortion rights outside of just looking at the law is becoming very, very common in maybe more than 40 or 45 countries now, through the Women Help Women and Women on Web movements, where you can either contact an international network and get sent abortion pills through the post, or you can contact a helpline, a national helpline in your country, and get information on how to have a safe abortion, although it may be illegal to do anything more than give information. At least you have somebody who will help you. And this is an example of a group in Cameroon who call themselves a call center, and they're for young women. And the numbers of young women contacting them have gone up very rapidly with that group. And we wrote this newsletter article about it in April this year. And this is my last slide. This is the one that makes me cry. This is Argentina in December 2020, the night that the Parliament of Argentina stayed up until about 5 o'clock in the morning debating for the second time an abortion bill that had been turned down previously. And this is a picture of what I mean by a critical mass of support. This every little green spot in this photograph represents a person, and they're standing in the street in front of the parliament, as close as they can get to it at the front. And primarily, this is young women in this picture, and they were out there, you know, shouting, doing slogans, singing all night long while this debate was going on. And a journalist the next morning said abortion was legalized in the street before it was legalized in the parliament. So that, I mean, that's something to aspire to, which most of us have never achieved. So here's some questions if you want some questions to talk about now. We have 15 minutes, and if you can stay longer, both Shruti and I are happy to stay longer and continue the discussion. But let me just go on and say thank you for joining this webinar. That our website, which is on this slide, has abortion information helplines listed from 30 or 35 countries, information about the campaign and its members, and an international news archive that contains all the articles that we've published since 2015 every week on news of abortion from all around the world. And we hope you will make use of it. So let me just go back to this list and hand over, I think, to Shruti to manage the discussion. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you, Marge. That was indeed a very, very powerful image from Argentina that you showed.
Yeah.
Yes. Any questions, any clarifications, any comments? In case you're not able to unmute, just let me know on chat and I will see what to do. Marge, we can wait and see if people are asking questions. But one thing that did come to my mind was around this thing of legalization and decriminalization. And 2 years ago, when the law was being discussed in India, I think the problem was that the new amendment that was proposed came from the government, and it had a few exceptions in terms of when abortion is going to be legalized beyond 20 weeks. And I think it was again in that limited framework of gestational limit being increased from 20 weeks to 22 weeks in case of rape or violence, or in case of fetal anomaly. And I think that is the biggest challenge, that the framework within which the law is proposed to be amended is still the same. And ideally, we would like to see a law such as that, the one in Canada. But every time the law is discussed, activists within India would collect, there will be so many discussions, but we end up falling within that limited framework of what the gestational limits are. And I think that is what came to my mind when you asked, why is it that there is no other country beyond Canada right now?
That's true. I mean, it needs a movement of some kind to raise these issues and take people out of the box they're in on the subject and make them broader.
Yes.
That's easier said than done in some cases. But
Yeah.
that's why, just to say this to everybody, that's why Shruti and I and so many others of us are working in networks and trying to broaden the reach we have to try and raise these issues with people. Because I'll tell you a little story that interested me a couple of years ago in Brazil. I passed for the 28th of September, probably 5 or 6, 7 years ago, decided to make a video, and they went out into the street in Brazil, and one person would walk up to somebody in the street and say, "Can I ask you a question? Do you think abortion is a good thing or a bad thing?" And everybody who answered the question said, "Oh, it's a bad thing, it's a bad thing." And then they asked, "Do you know anybody who's had an abortion?" And almost everybody said, "Yes, I do." And then the questioner said, "And do you think that person should be in jail because they've had an abortion?" And I said, "No, of course not." And that was an eye-opener for everybody they talked to. And funny to watch that video, actually, because of the quick change in terms of attitude. And you had things like people saying, "Well, I've had an abortion and I know it's wrong and my church says it's wrong, but I really needed it and I know God will forgive me." So, you know, that's the kind of conversation you can have. And I remember another situation where the woman who started the Women's Health Network in Latin America in the 1980s said that they were really afraid to talk to anybody about abortion, but they decided to go out to a village and brought a group of women together to have a conversation, and they were very nervous about introducing it. And the women from the village said the same thing as I discovered in Greece when I was there. "Oh, we have abortions every year. You know, we have no choice. We have no contraception. We can discuss this as much as you want. We have no problem with abortion." So I think sometimes you get the impression that everybody except you is against, you know, and it isn't true.
Yeah. I think somebody had also mentioned about their own experience. But Marge, there was a question earlier, how many times can one get an abortion?
Yeah.
And I think there was a comment around the disorder called Asherman syndrome, which is a complication of having so many abortions that lead to scarring of uterus, subsequently cause infertility. So most women ask us having baby after abortion, which is their concern. I was wondering if you wanted to say something in response to that.
The only thing that will affect fertility in that sense is an unsafe abortion. That's all I have to say.
Yeah.
Abortion does not cause infertility unless it's unsafe. And even then, it doesn't always cause infertility. You know, the infertility is usually a consequence of an infection in the uterus and in the fallopian tubes and in the ovaries caused by a septic abortion. You know, introducing something into the uterus to stop the pregnancy that causes infection, so something unsafe. And that's what causes infertility. If that then travels up into the fallopian tubes and into the ovaries and is not treated quickly. All right, I see somebody says, I have a question for Marge about this last topic on the PDF. Do you believe it would be productive trying to create or push for an international law legalizing abortion, although that might sound too utopic? I have to say that I put this question there because it's the first time I'd thought about it while I was writing these slides. I think it's a conversation worth having. And I'm planning to propose it to everybody I talk to see what they think about it. I think it is utopic. I think given that it's been 100 years that we've been trying to, you know, make abortion safe and legal, and accepted healthcare globally is indicative of how utopic it probably is as a question. But I think as a form of advocacy, if as an international movement, we could stand behind, a few things like this, a form of legalizing that we can agree on, the belief that abortion is essential health care, and that the right to decide whether or not to continue a pregnancy should be treated as a human right for everybody who can get pregnant. I think all of those are unifying kinds of positions that can allow you to bring a lot of people on your side in what will remain a battle, I think, for a long time yet. So I think that's my answer. And I'd love to hear what the rest of you have to say about it.
Paula, would you like to say something about this?
You have to unmute her.
I was writing. Well, first, thank you for answering. And I actually agree. I believe in mutual help, or, as you said, creating or setting some necessary standards for global legalization of abortion. But yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it's a topic, but I think it's very necessary to work together internationally too. Thank you, Marge.
Thank you. So let's do that. I think that's the point of it.
Any other questions before we close? Otherwise, I think that's a great point to close at.
Okay. Thank you for listening. We'd love to hear from you again.
Thank you, Marge. Thanks so much. There are so many messages for you in the chat. I hope you have seen it. Many people are saying that
I haven't looked at any of them yet, but I will afterwards.
Yes, they're saying that the presentation is quite informative and they really liked it.
Oh, I'm glad to hear it.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks, everybody. And I will see you all next week in the next session. Thanks, Marge.
Thank you.